I always start D&D Rules Solution with a little who's who on Dungeons and Dragons. Today we're talking about Greg Tito. Of course, you may be familiar with Mr. Tito if you Tito. I wonder if it would trigger him if I just like overpronounce the T's in his names. Gregory Tito. He is, of course, the senior communication manager for Wizards of the Coast, heavily involved in all D&D products, particularly since streaming kind of came to the forefront as a promotional outlet for Wizards and their D&D products. If you've ever watched their stream or if you've listened to Dragon Talk, then you'll be familiar with Greg Tito and, of course, his partner in crime, Shelly Manzanoble. So that's Greg, and he is the front person for all public relations around D&D and most of their tertiary products. Greg actually comes from a healthy mix of writing and editorial experience in the gaming industry. He started early on in not just editing and TTRPG game design, but he also dabbled a little bit in the video games industry, things like PAX and E3. We saw in his extensive resume of experience. And he actually started his biggest gigs that I've seen were as editor-in-chief, writer-contributor for The Escapist and Warcry.com. So like I said, beyond that, he actually has a fairly rich history in theater production, believe it or not, and writing credentials for stage. So brethren right there, big history in theater and performing arts. I also share that, and I also have a background in communication. Tito, let's have coffee. We both have a background in theater performance and or theater production and performing arts, and we both have backgrounds in public relations and communications. So, yeah, get at me. Is that what people say now? I don't know. Beyond that, he did dabble a lot in RPG writing design for Goodman Games, actually, which is a pretty big brand, too. And since then, moved to Seattle, has never looked back as the front person for this new iteration of Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons & Dragons. And that's Greg Tito. Next up in D&D Rules Solution, we're stepping into character creation. So we're actually getting into this point in the Player's Handbook where we're talking about character creation. I wanted to share my personal approach to character creation. I typically prefer to, rather than go through, let's say, the recipe that's in the PHB where you talk, race, then class, then way later you get into background. First thing I do is I encourage my players to think about archetype. So what type of player do you see or type of character do you see yourself playing? What are some of your favorite heroes in fantasy? Now, vet players might not need this type of guidance, but I find it really helpful for new players or anyone who's really just looking for a different approach to developing their own characters. So I start with archetype, get them to think about what type of character they want. Then we go into background so they can flesh out what their story is, what got them to where they are. Then from there, that feeds class selection, so we can pick a vocation that better supports that vision that they have of their character. And then we go into race to determine like how they storify the racial features or the cultural elements that they want to bring into the character and what abilities better support the type of character that they're building at that moment. And then last, actually, is abilities, because it's very seldomly you're going to run into a point where you don't have the abilities scores to support the class you want to play. So I actually do abilities last. So here's how that plays out. You select your archetype. To help them get there, I ask them if they, a couple of qualifying questions. If they prefer melee or range, do they see themselves as an upfront attacker, or do they like to stay back and contribute from a distance? Is there a fantasy trope that they like to play, like, your humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, things like that? Or would you like something more exotic, like a half giant or a celestial or a cat person? And then do you see yourself being more spell focused or standard fare, like arrows, javelins, thrown daggers, or a mix of both perhaps? And then I asked them if you prefer to play more combat heavy. Do you like the active engagement of combat, or are you more into the RP and the narrative and the interplay with other players and NPCs, or do you like a healthy mix of both? Those 4 simple qualifying questions give me a pretty good idea of what type of character a player might want to begin with. And then we go into background. So we begin the start of their story. How do they get to where they are? What are some of their motivations? Then we talk about classes to fit that archetype and what's available in the tools that we have to play the game. What race best supports them, both from a narrative and mechanical perspective. I always preface that the mechanical benefits are usually what I use to draw that decision, because I find things that narrative are and should be baked into, race are baked into the story and their narrative. They should be limited by that. So I'm quite open with how race actually applies. It's more of those mechanical benefits and features that are going to better affect how the player plays that character. And then I just keep it light and try to get the players into the action as quickly as possible. That comes from a lot of feedback I've had from players and people that I've introduced to D&D, that they've always had a much better time when the character creation was fun and light and they're learning it, but then straight into the action as quickly as possible. I've had games where we spend a whole 2 hours on character creation and then maybe 15 minutes of play at the end. And I've also done ones where we just do the character light enough to get into the game, and then we flesh out the character as we play through the first scenario for a couple of hours instead. Invariably, without fail, I always get better feedback with that latter approach, where you take a small amount of time to create a character, just enough so that they're playable, and then you get them right into a scenario, into a game, and they kind of learn and build the character as they're playing out. So that has been the approach that I've taken ever since that unlock happened for me. And that's really my approach to stepping into character creation. Next up, we're going to look at backgrounds specifically. We're going to go through that order that I said, archetype into backgrounds, into class, and then finally into race. And we'll talk about abilities in a future segment of D&D Rule Solution. Moving right along with D&D Rule Solution, we're talking about character creation as it relates to backgrounds. Again, I usually focus on the mechanical benefits of backgrounds if you're selecting them from the official source materials, because that mechanical benefit I feel are the most, the backgrounds themselves, the narrative elements of the background is where I feel like you have the most fluidity and the most flexibility to write whatever you want. So I always give my players full control of their own narrative backstories, but they must take the set of benefits mechanically that come from those backstories. So usually I tell my players to look at what set of benefits they feel best works for their character, and then consider the background more fluid and malleable. So if you like what you get as an Outlander, but you don't really like the Outlander background, then I'll say take the benefits from Outlander, but then let's write your own backstory to tailor to what you need and what you like. So that includes the starting gold and tools, includes proficiencies and skills that come with that background, the languages, and the one background feature that every background has, which is just kind of like it's like a feat that applies to the narrative, so you can find shelter in any kind of city setting, or you automatically know your way around urban centers, things like that benefit the narrative of these players. And then I encourage PCs to select that background that best fits the vision they have for fleshing out the rest of their player history, and accept the set of in-game benefits that go with that backstory. From there, we go into choosing a class on D&D Rule Solution. So continuing with character creation, once you've got your backstory and your vision figured out for the character, it's time to choose a class or vocation that best supports that. Now, classes come with a core archetype, and then there are always several subclass options for those classes. So this is where you can match a player's job, let's say, to what the archetypal vision they have for their character is. And typically characters start at level 1, as we know, but a lot of DMs I know favor starting characters at level 3, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the stream, level 1 and level 2 characters are fairly squishy and vulnerable, and they don't always make it through that early set, and you want to give them the best fighting chance they have while you allow the dice to do things that dice do. Level progression in 5e is standardized, which means that the thresholds for leveling are the same for everyone regardless of class. Previous editions of D&D had different XP thresholds based on the class that you chose, but in this case it's universal, which keeps it nice and easy. And the other class and subclass options are also available in various editions of source books that were available or made available after the PHB was launched. So specifically, those include Xanathar's Guide to Everything, the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, and there was, for the first time ever in D&D 5e history since the PHB launched, they announced the only addition to player class or core classes with the Artificer that came out with Eberron Rising from the Last War. So that's where you'll find those classes. It's a little bit more concentrated, but there are tons of subclasses in a variety of other compendiums like Xanathar's and things like that. I think there are some in Elemental Evil as well. So if you want to open those up to your players, just do a quick scan and see where those subclasses lie so you can find out what compendiums you'll need to support that. But ultimately, that'll give you a full breadth of view on how you can define a class or a job, let's say, to match the player vision that those players have for their characters. Next up, continuing with character creation on D&D Rules Solution to round out this week, we are choosing a race. So once you've got your background and your archetype all sorted out, you know what kind of class you want to be. Let's take a look at some race options to help support that. Now, of course, this is a pretty significant topic in our community right now. I've mentioned my stand on that last week, and I support the change in the game that better reflects the society of players who enjoy it. But race has always been pretty fluid in my game, and that's how I've run it as a GM, and that is our prerogative as GM. So I'll remind our game-faring public out there that it's always in your power to change, correct, manipulate, or audit those types of things as you see fit to provide the best example of play that you can for you and your players. How I do that is I make race basically available in the same way that I handle backgrounds. So personally, I like to choose races with abilities and features that supplement the class that I'm going to play, but I will always choose a narrative version of that race and then see, what best suits the type of play that I want to have. So in this case, they use a dwarf named Brunor in the player's handbook as the sample, which strangely enough is a callback to Driz Do'Urden's companions that we mentioned at the beginning of the stream around Icewind Dale. So little Easter egg there, I guess, for you. This, of course, is Brunor Battlehammer, the infamous dwarf who accompanied Driz Do'Urden through his adventures. When choosing a race, there are always races and sub-race options as well. I typically focus mainly on the abilities and features, as I mentioned. Then I allow my players to form any history or story around whatever race they've chosen, free of pretense or perception, I might add. So there's nothing that's baked in there. I never anchor it to anything that's text or contextual. It's really up to my players to determine what the history was for that character. Since the player's handbook, there have been a number of post-published compendiums that have come with a whole host of other race and sub-race options. The largest was Volo's Guide to Monsters, followed closely in second by Eberron Rising from the Last War and the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. So both those compendiums have a number of race and sub-race options. The Elemental Evil Player's Compendium and the new Mythic Odysseys of Theros Compendium also have 4 or 5 race options as well. And then, of course, there were single race releases that came out from Wizards, which include the Tortle, Lokatha, or Lokatha, and the Grung aquatic races. So keep in mind of those if you're looking to expand the host of options that are available to your players for races. And that's a wrap for D&D Rules Solution this week. Next week, we're going further into actual abilities, how they're rolled, options for rolling, as well as requisites, bonuses, and actually building your character once you've got these other things defined. So check that out.